Welcome to this presentation then on the poem London by William Blake. The picture you can see in the background is of London in 1795. As you can see, a very different place from the London we know today. The River Thames, as you can see, has changed its shape slightly. It is being much more forced into a particular set way of flowing. London itself was also much smaller in those days, but this was also a time of change. London was slowly developing and getting much bigger. The small London you see in front of you at the moment rapidly changed over the next 20 years due to the Industrial Revolution. As normal, we're going to look at AO1, the meaning of the poem, AO3, the context and poet knowledge, and of course AO2, which is our effect of language, form and structure. This then is William Blake. Some facts about him. Blake was a poet and an artist who specialised in illuminated texts, often of religious nature. He rejected various established religions for various reasons. One of the main ones was its failure of the established church to help children in London who were forced to work. He expected the church to help the people of London, not just ignore them. Blake lived and worked in the capital city, so was arguably well placed to write clearly about the conditions of people who lived there faced. At one point, though, he moved away from home for around about 4 years, and when he returned, he didn't recognise the home he had left behind. He was shocked as he wandered the streets of London. George III was on the throne when Blake was writing. He was seen to be more interested in class and politics than everyday people. Blake was in favour of overthrowing the monarchy, as he believed they didn't really care about the people they supposedly were meant to be there to help. Blake was also heavily inspired by the French Revolution. You can see the picture on the screen there. This is where the people rose up against the government and the monarchy after food rationing meant the people of Paris were going starving. In 1789, to give you a bit of background of the revolution, a few years before the poem was written, the French people revolted against the monarchy and aristocracy, using violence and murder to overthrow those in power. Blake saw the French Revolution as inspirational, a model for how ordinary disadvantaged people could seize power. Blake alludes to the revolution in the poem London, arguably suggesting the experience of living there could encourage a revolution on the streets of the capital. He was involved in an uprising himself, an uprising known as the Gordon Riots, that tried to stop the government limiting people's freedom. Here then is a quick video that gives you an idea of what the French Revolution was like and what perhaps Blake is predicting in the poem London. A reading then of the poem itself, but this case slightly modernised, so we realise that potentially what Blake was saying about London in 1795 is perhaps just as true now as it was then.
Through each charted street, near where the charted tamesters flow, and marking every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of war. In every cry of every man, cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, the mind-forged manacles are here. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church applauds, and the hapless soldiers sigh, runs of blood down palace walls. But most from midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlots curse, blasts a newborn infant's tear, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse.
A film and a poem filled with anger and frustration about what people are having to go through on every day in London streets. As normal, we're now going to go through the poem itself then with possible things you could say from the beginning, middle and end. You can see the sketch in the background. This is a sketch from London at the time as the citizens of London scurried through these pretty rough streets. The simple title makes clear who the poem is about and suggests the poem is for everyone in London rather than just the rich or indeed the poor. Blake describes himself as wandering, implying that he's walking without purpose. He is overwhelmed by what he sees in his hometown streets and so is taking his time to retake in how bad people actually feel. The word charted implies that London has been mapped as if nature has been controlled by man and cannot break free. So it's actually like God's country is being controlled here, rather than just the people. Near where the charted Thames just flow, then repeats the word charted, implying then that the river in London is obviously controlled. And the mark in every face I meet, mark of weakness and marks of woe. The repetition of the word marks is a metaphor for the branding of the people, as if the people are animals controlled by their masters. The middle of the poem. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. The repetition of every through the middle of the poem emphasises the number of people affected and the growing anger that Blake feels about it. Blake uses deliberately simplistic language so that everyone, rich and poor, could understand his message regardless of their level of education. Mind-forged manacles is probably one of the most interesting quotes in the whole poem. The phrase mind-forged manacles suggests the handcuffs that bind the people are in their heads. They are emotional prisoners due to the laws and the power of those in charge. They may also believe they are weak and so cannot fight. This particular line, "Mind forge manacles I hear," is an attack on the people of London, as if Blake is telling them that they're too weak. They should be standing up and revolting against those who have put them in this position. We then have words like cry, blacken, appalls, hapless, runs in blood. The angry tone continues as Blake vents his frustration as he watches, in effect, his people die. The rich and the poor and the powerful and the powerless are juxtaposed here, the chimney sweepers and the church in this case. The least powerful are the children who are being told what to do by the power of the church. Blake believes the church should be helping these innocent children, but they're not. He uses the word appalls, which is a pun, which suggests the church is shocked by what's happening. But appall is also black cloth over a body. This is a metaphor for the true effect of the church on the people of London. It's like the church is killing the people rather than potentially helping them. And now to the end of the poem. But most through midnight streets I hear. The word midnight is a metaphor for darkness, foreshadowing perhaps the future of London when the people revolt. Darkness is coming unless something changes. How the youthful harlots curse. The word harlots is a formal term for prostitutes. Blake emphasises the age of the prostitutes, these youthful harlots, as if the next generation had been corrupted by the male rulers and their misuse of power. As with the rest of the poem, we have rhyming here to suggest the poem is meant to sound like a nursery rhyme or give a very childlike message that is very simple to understand. This means then that everyone would understand Blake's message as well as potentially remember it. The rhyming would obviously help them remember the key message of the poem. The simplistic rhyming also might suggest Blake's own steps through London, as each small step is taken and he looks around his hometown and reacts with disgust or shock. The word plague in and blights the plagues the marriage hearse. The word plague implies a sexual disease which then infects a marriage, which would then go on to destroy that marriage as the plague spreads, and obviously that plague would then be transferred to the children who may be deformed in the future, as if this plague that's taking over London, this plague of disease, this plague of famine, this plague of sadness, is then going to infect the next generation as well. The lack of a full stop at the end of the poem suggests then that this sadness might be never-ending. There's no end to the misery unless man does something about it, as Blake is suggesting. Perhaps time then to revolt. Key messages then for the poem London. Who is it about? Well, it's Blake wandering the streets of his old hometown. What happens in it? As he walks, he sees how badly the everyday people are suffering and implies that a revolution is coming. Why was it written? Blake makes clear the difference between rich and poor and warns those in power what will happen if they don't listen to the people. He juxtaposes the greatness of London with the life on its streets as he walks down the streets he walks down for deliberate ironic effect. As normal, I'm now going to give you then 3 quotes with the notes around it. Please pause the video to make notes on these into your workbooks. And quote number 2. And quote number 3. You'll notice the 3 quotes taken deliberately from the beginning, middle and end of the poem, so if you were to write all 3 of them, you'd have a good spread of the whole poem itself, which would make a structural comment as well as a language-based one. We'll now focus then on how to write these as an essay using our 9-point plan. As normal, the ones in red are the key ones you'd need to pass the test. If you were to add the ones in black, then obviously these would gain marks as well. I've put on the board again then the 3 criteria we're assessed for, but in this case just the top level criteria. You'll notice in red the words sensitive and evaluative. Today I'm going to talk you through how to create a sensitive and evaluative response. As you can see, I've written up the first 2 paragraphs of my answer. Blake simplistically confronts us not only with sadness and death on London streets, but makes us reflect on the misuse of power, often using irony to make us think about who is responsible for the pain and suffering. You'll notice I start off my answer then by saying what the simple answer would be. Every candidate, everyone in the exam hall when you're writing up your answer is going to be telling the exam board that the poem is about sadness and death. But here I've tried to push that further. I've said the phrase makes us reflect, as if I personally am thinking about my own interpretation of the poem. I'm thinking what it really means and the message Blake might have for me. That is then a sensitive response. I then start my second paragraph with from the outset, implying that I'm looking at the opening of the poem, the beginning of the poem, and thinking what that particular section is talking about. I then mention the fact that he might be seen as a tourist in London, but then added my contextual information. I've said it's actually his home. Then I use my first quote, wanders through the smog-filled streets of industrial London. I've put in there industrial London, as I said at the beginning of the clip, implying then that I'm well aware this is a time of change for London. The Industrial Revolution had had a big impact, and in Blake's own lifetime, the number of people living in London perhaps quadrupled compared with when he was first living there when he was young. Notice that I then say in my introduction to the small selection of quotes, he appears aimless, yet clearly has a purpose. Once again, I'm kind of implying there is a simple meaning. Oh, he's wandering the streets, he doesn't know what to do. But I know after reading the whole poem that Blake clearly has a purpose here. So perhaps the opening of the poem is a bit misleading. He points out the church. I then give a collection of quotes. Chartered Thames, Palace, Church. And then I think, well, why those 3 places? I begin to evaluate why Blake might have chosen the details he did. In this case, I came to the conclusion that it was to signify man's control. They're all places that are either being controlled, the Thames, the palace, perhaps linking to Buckingham Palace, and the church, which might easily be something like St Paul's Cathedral. I then focus on one of them, the word chartered in this case, which is an adjective describing the Thames. I've then sort of forces us to accept, the phrase here, forces us to accept. Again, I'm suggesting that the quote has made me think. It has made me contemplate exactly what Blake might mean. Forces us to accept the rich have conquered London and even control what should be free, the River Thames. The tone here is thought-provoking. So now I'm moving on to my structural comment. The tone would count as structure. I'm thinking how the line would be said. How would it be spoken out loud? And I've thought about here the tone representing Blake's anger and frustration at what's going on around him. I wouldn't need to know much about the poem to write that, of course. I know the poem is about Blake's unhappiness about London, so it's not a big stretch to say the tone is very angry. You can then see I've moved on to the next paragraph, beginning with as the poem develops. As an activity you might like to do for yourselves, it might be a wonderful idea to kind of continue this answer and think, okay, how can I show my feelings about the poem? How can I suggest that I've really thought about Blake's message and the words he's using? Can I evaluate how big an impact those different phrases are? And obviously I pick the most phrases or sentences or lines that have the most impact to then talk about in my exam answer. This will be part of a 4-paragraph response. You can see the first 2 paragraphs on the board. You'd go on to the middle of the poem and then indeed the end of the poem, picking out the best quotes or the best lexical fields to comment on and why those quotes / groups of words are so powerful. Now, the beauty of this poem is that it can be compared to pretty much every other poem in the anthology, so I thought I'd give you some examples of different poems that London could be compared to. The first is Ozymandias, or Hawk Roosting, both of which also cover the corruption of power. You might want to talk about the prelude. Here, the idea of God is more powerful than man. Blake thinks and hates the fact that man controls nature. And lastly, I might look at the poem Exposure, a poem then clearly about the deaths of soldiers and men due to the misuse of power. Blake, in his poem, of course, focuses not just on the men, but on the women as well. Thank you then for listening to my video about the poem London by William Blake.